Well, that's exciting. I don't think anyone's ready for this.
No,
No.
I would agree.
I mean, I'm not ready. I'm not even wearing shoes.
Yeah, these slippers will
You
do.
got slippers on. Mm. Right. So we're here in Hove, International City of Mystery,
It's the happening place.
in the United Kingdom, the freely independent. Did I say freely? I meant
did.
recently. The recently independent United Kingdom. Oh boy.
Oh yeah, our own little colony.
I, of course, am Curtin. I'm sitting here with uh, a person we like to call the Doctor. When I say we, I mean nobody. Nobody calls him that. Not even his mom.
Is there a doctor in the room? Yeah, me. Just my nickname.
This is Nick Young. Nick, what's your middle name?
Alexander.
That's right. Which is kind of like your sister's first name of Amber. It's interesting.
Not really, but sure. If anything, the female equivalent would just be Alex.
Yeah, well, that's for another episode. We can talk about that. So your initials are Nay, Nay, which is exciting. And the reason I prefer New York, of course you do. Now the reason we met is because we did some kind of pub quiz in Uganda, 2014. Is that right?
Sounds about right.
I don't know how you got there, but I met some teachers at an Internations event who invited me. Why were you there?
I was teaching at the school.
Oh, that's right.
I went with the teachers.
That's right. They said you would show up to work functions quietly and just observe. Good times. And if I remember correctly, we won that pub quiz. That's so. Right. Kept the streak alive of winning the first pub quiz in a new country. It was exciting. And the next week we had to write the quiz.
And I believe
which
that
was a team building exercise.
Yep. We only won that one quiz anyway.
That's right. The only one we ever won.
The end of the streak.
So what were your, just to give the four listeners out there some background, what were your first impressions of me during this pub quiz events of 2014?
I mean, the initial impressions I remember of you were largely amusement. You had quite an interesting way of socializing, which stuck out from the awkward and uncomfortable dynamics that I'm used to. You would say the weird thing that was happening in the room, and you'd point to the elephant that everyone else was trying to avoid, and I was like, this is interesting conversation.
Yeah.
You basically did intentionally the thing that I do by mistake all the time. And I was like, that's cool, I can hang with this guy, because I'll do it by mistake and he'll make it seem like it was on purpose.
Like it was on purpose. And that's one thing over the years that's kind of, that we've seen a lot of is you and I doing similar things, but for maybe very different reasons or in different ways.
Yeah.
And to a lot of outsiders, people think that we're like oil and water. Because we have a different style or a different, take on something. But actually, we're quite similar, which is very exciting. But this is not the point of the talk today. I just want to give a little bit of background. The point here is to ask a few soft hitting questions to the recently minted master of the mind, Mr. New York, NY. Give everyone a little bit of background on what you studied and why, and yeah.
What I studied and why.
Yeah.
So my initial field of interest was psychology. The reason why I'd become kind of fascinated in consciousness as a soft topic. I was into a lot of meditation, a lot of New Age practices. I had quite a history with psychedelics, and it all kind of got me into the idea of understanding consciousness as a valid topic. So I went to university to pursue consciousness science.
This was in Uganda?
No, this was at University of Southampton in the UK.
Southampton. Or as we Americans say, Southampton.
Sounds almost the same.
Yeah.
And I discovered sort of a year and a half into the process that I didn't actually enjoy psychology very much.
Oh, man.
And that it was very hard to study consciousness from the perspective of psychology, which was almost entirely theory-based.
Okay.
It's theory competing against theory. And theory for consciousness is not all that useful because it's not testable. But I'd say roughly halfway through the degree, I did stumble across a few small studies that had actually started to look into the direction of consciousness.
Oh.
And these were simple studies using things such as phenomena known as binocular rivalry,
Ooh.
in which you show a participant something different to each eye, and then you monitor brain activity relative to which image they say they're seeing. So a classic one is showing people a face in one eye and a house in the other. And you kind of get them to record when they're seeing a face, when they're seeing a house, and you monitor brain activity relative to what they're consciously perceiving.
I would assume that because we're more conditioned to recognize details in faces, I would assume that face would win out more often than not. That's just me guessing as a layman.
I mean, that's an entirely plausible idea, and it probably is something like what they found. But they chose faces and houses because there are distinct brain areas that have been shown to correspond to faces and houses.
Ah.
So faces is the fusiform face area, and houses is the parahippocampal place area. So they knew what they were looking for in the brain.
This would cause a problem, though, because I had a teacher in high school whose face kind of looked like a house.
Well, he would kind of stimulate both areas of the brain.
I don't think his wife would agree with that. But all right, so you're in Southampton, which is in the European version of the UK back in the day.
Yep, that was when we were still.
And you quit, or did you finish your bachelor's?
I finished.
You finished the bachelor's.
My degree.
Okay. And then you pissed off somewhere. Where'd you go?
I went to Uganda. Accidentally.
Good.
More or less.
How does one accidentally go to the Pearl of Africa?
Well, I had no fixed reason to stay in Southampton. I was only there for my studies. So when
You recently divorced?
From my home in Bournemouth, yeah. And I wanted to move back with the family for a short period of time, who lived in London back then, to try and figure out where I would go next. And they agreed that I could come back. So this was sort of towards the end of third year, getting into my dissertation, getting into the harder bits of the degree, with the plan of, it's fine, after this I go to London. Following this, a few months later, my mum tells me, "Oh, we're moving to Uganda, so you're still welcome to come home, but home is Uganda. Do you want to come with us?" I didn't really have the time available to go, "Oh no, I'll figure out where I'm going to be living in the UK."
So there you go.
So I went to Uganda.
There you go. If your parents join the circus, you better learn how to do the trapeze. Yeah.
Just get used to putting on some makeup.
So you're well, we're already well past that. You're unhappy with a psychology degree, hungering for some consciousness studies, lost in Uganda, playing pub quiz with Americans. So what brought you back? What brought you back for your master's?
Well, I never lost my passion for consciousness as a topic of discussion and as a topic of research. Whilst in Uganda, I did a lot of reading. I actually completed the reading of the module for the neuroscience of consciousness at the University of Sussex in the UK.
Sussex.
I was in contact with researchers over here, all the while having a really great quality of life, climbing, kayaking, enjoying the sun, having a good time with friends. Despite having this amazing quality of life, I still had to keep reading about consciousness, and I was still interested in it. So I kind of realized, despite a good salary and an amazing lifestyle, I was going to have to do the master's at some point.
Now, what were your options? Because you can do a psychology degree pretty much every continent.
Yes.
But when it comes to higher degrees in consciousness, I wouldn't expect every school offers that.
No, and there's not a direct pathway from psychology into consciousness necessarily. So I did some research. Well, I've done research over the years, and the most promising looking university was the University of Sussex, who offered a master's in cognitive neuroscience. And this is also the home to the Sackler Center for Consciousness Science.
Shout out.
So I thought that would probably be a good place to align my studies.
So how many of these consciousness centers do you think there are in the world?
Surprisingly few.
Yeah.
This is one of the few in the UK. I think this is probably the only one in the UK. There may be something else smaller. I think there's one in Cambridge as well.
So now this might be a little interesting because in the last few years we've all seen a lot about AI, machine learning. We're talking about SpaceX and electric cars and all these kind of future industries people are getting excited about. But when it comes to consciousness, it seems there aren't that many experts. You already mentioned theory before in psychology. There are a lot of theories. There's some TED Talks about what the ancients believed consciousness was to them. But it seems we're making so many leaps forward in all these scientific fields. Tell us a little bit about where consciousness stands compared to all those.
Consciousness is a really difficult topic to study for many reasons. Primarily, there's almost always a simpler explanation than looking at consciousness. So, for example, the studies I explained earlier, where you're looking at a face in a house, you can say, by looking at brain activity, you can say, oh, look, these areas are lighting up when they're seeing the face, and these when they're seeing the house. And this part of that brain, which is corresponded in both, must relate to conscious visual processes. But how do you eliminate just switches in attention?
All right.
Immediately, there's a simpler answer. But I think most of the mystery behind consciousness science comes from a fundamental lack of the actual capacity to capture consciousness using current scientific methods, which are about freezing something in time and then making predictions about what it will do in the future, and then trying to show that, 99.9% of the time, when I've predicted this, it happened again and again and again, at least under these conditions. So when I freeze, say, consciousness in this moment of time and make a prediction, I expect this to follow. But in reality, consciousness cannot really be frozen in time and still be consciousness.
Yeah, we were talking yesterday about some of the difficulties of applying the traditional scientific method to consciousness. It's really impossible to have a control group.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's difficult to replicate exact experiments because you're never dealing with you can't step in the same river twice kind of idea. So it is a kind of a different, you have to use different tools, right?
Yes.
And of course, with simpler explanations, a lot of people will just kind of second guess any research that's out there. But it is one of the most fascinating concepts that us humans have been dealing with for thousands of years. Some of the greatest minds have not gone into alchemy or steel working or shipbuilding. They've talked about consciousness over these thousands of years. And yesterday we also talked a little bit about the self-narrative and how we kind of love this image of ourselves. We're always trying to boost it up. Do you believe that because of our unique relationship with consciousness, every generation of humans keeps this topic in the foreground of their mind?
Yes, I would certainly say that our self-identification with conscious processes is probably the reason that we push so much to try and understand them. But I also think that this is partly one of the blocks to actually understanding consciousness from any genuine scientific perspective. It's entirely possible that we've actually made leaps and bounds in understanding consciousness already by understanding simple things like visual processes, perceptual processes. But what scientists are looking for is the part where these mechanical processes become some subjective effect. Now, it's not entirely necessary that subjectivity be any different than the material, mechanical processes of the brain, except for the fact that when we reflect upon our own conscious experience, we think it cannot just be mere mechanism. It must be, where am I in these mechanistic processes? And to accept a purely mechanical view of consciousness from the mind kind of eliminates the I in the picture altogether, where it really points to the illusory nature of I and gives you a very simplistic view of the mind, which we seem to want to avoid in favor of the mystery of consciousness.
Yeah, there's some argument about whether I am having my experience of my consciousness, or if what I am naming my consciousness is actually just a shared kind of consciousness,
Yeah.
and I'm interpreting it as something special to me. What are your I'm not going to hold you to it, but what are your unofficial thoughts on something like that?
Can you continue with the question?
Yeah, sure.
Clarify.
Sure. So, well, let's say a metaphor. If the sun is out and I get sunburnt,
Yes.
I might think, oh, this star is affecting me, and I'm getting sunburnt, and I take it very personally.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, what's happening is the sun is just shooting out rays in every single direction. It doesn't really care what's in the way of them.
Yeah.
If it's my body, or if it's the roof of a house, or a salamander. So I'm misinterpreting the sun's rays. They're not really meant for me. they're just rays.
Yes.
And I can't really understand the sun's rays hitting the house or the salamander. But when they hit me, I all of a sudden can say, "Oh, these are warm. Ooh, my skin is getting burned." So, do you think that consciousness is more of a personal, something that I don't know, comes from within us, or do you think it's something that we're actually experiencing, and then we just kind of interpret as a personal experience?
My personal and perhaps highly controversial views about consciousness would be that consciousness is simply a process that is happening, and I would argue across species.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that consciousness of a bacterium is anything even remotely like the consciousness of a human, but I think the number of possible behavioral outcomes that a bacterium has, and the fact that a bacteria can choose to move towards positive foods that will be good for it and away from poisons, means that it has at least two options. So I would argue that perhaps the consciousness of a bacterium is good versus bad, obviously without the language that we have,
right,
because that's linguistics, but perhaps some version of an orientation feeling and some of an aversive feeling. Otherwise, it's strange to suggest how a bacterium can function at all without some kind of interface in which it can work in its environment. I think it's awfully grandiose of humans to think that we're specifically unique to we're the only things with an interface. Surely we're the only things with probably we're the only things with a linguistic interface. So we think about our consciousness with language. But does that eliminate the capacity for all other creatures to have some kind of rudimentary consciousness that is non-linguistic?
Well, you could also talk about human newborns before they maybe have the concept of language, before they have a mother tongue. Most likely they still have conscious thoughts. They grab for things and they cry and they want certain things, and they're interacting with other humans without a personal narrative in English or Russian or Chinese at that point. Yeah. Okay.
So, kind of an extension of that, I would say that consciousness is merely a process that is happening to the vast majority of organic beings that have some kind of capacity to choose. But without the actual personal narrative, the personal narrative is something that humans add to our consciousness. And through that, we give it a sense of possession. This is my consciousness. It is only your consciousness insofar as it is the point of view by which consciousness is arising. Through that, you identify with it. But it's not necessarily yours. If you were, in fact, as you said, the star that is shooting down rays, or the sun that's shooting down rays on the Earth, if you have the point of view from that star as the thing that was emitting the rays, then you would also believe that you were that star. But rather, consciousness arises purely by the point of reference that information processing is occurring in. Within humans, we have this really complicated narrative, linguistic narrative, where I've seen myself from this point of view over and over again, therefore I assume that this self is me. But if I could change that point of view, which happens all the time, it happens when you fall asleep at night, it happens when you wake up in the morning, by what kind of claim, can I say that my point of view tomorrow is the same as it was yesterday?
Uh,
Apart from the fact that I have these kind of perceptual phenomena of constancy. But there's a huge number of examples in the psychological literature of illusions of constancy. Color constancy, for instance, you turn off the lights at night, and all of the objects in your room are objectively now a different color. But I haven't turned the wall hasn't turned green; it's still white. The wardrobe is still brown; it's not turned pink. But my mind allows me to have this kind of constancy
I see.
because accepting the amount of chaos, and I think consciousness is much more to do with a chaotic system of information than something sensible and linear. The more we focus on chaos, the less we can actually do, because chaos isn't all that productive for a simple creature like us. But in terms of chaos as a property that links all living things, chaos is how, changes happen. That's how dynamical systems evolve over time. You can't have a system which is constantly remaining the same and have evolution and changing of things over time.
Right, mutations and entropy and all of our old friends doing us a service, pushing everything forward here.
Yeah.
It seems like this whole world of consciousness has a lot of pressure, expectation on it to answer the old mythical questions, or some of them the more challenging ones that science never touched before. Things like deja vu, things like what are dreams, things
Yeah.
like, and a lot of people see consciousness as a hope that maybe this will tie everything together. How come twins have that special relationship? What about mother's intuition when her child is in trouble and she gets some kind of fright and she rushes home?
Yeah.
Oh, let's hope consciousness can explain all these things. And who knows, maybe it is consciousness, or maybe it's something about quantum entanglement and all these other things we don't understand. But do you also have high hopes that consciousness can kind of shed some light on things like hallucinations and dreams and deja vu, and how we understand memory?
No, not really. I would have. I think consciousness as a topic has become sort of it's a loose category. It's much like in biology when they have a list of types of organisms that we know, all within the same names. Then they have this whole other category for things that we don't quite know where they fit. They end up throwing all these animals into the same category. Then someone points out, wait a minute, all of these things have 6 nipples and these ones have 5. We can subdivide this category, and we begin to separate things that way. And I think anything in science that is mysterious and can be viewed from the subjective perspective, we can go, consciousness, that fits in that box, because we don't understand that and we don't understand these things. But I think one of the problems is consciousness doesn't have a clear definition. There is no agreement in the science as to what consciousness actually is yet. So you have a bunch of people trying to scientifically study a topic without actually knowing what it is that they're studying. So lots and lots of things fall into the realm of consciousness.
The big umbrella of consciousness.
And the problem is, even when you try to explain what consciousness is, it becomes difficult. And I think most people need to have a point of view within which area of consciousness they're actually trying to prove. But I definitely think the kind of subjective point of view is probably the most primitive point at which you can start.
All right. I'm going to go back to yesterday again. We were walking around looking for bagels and cream cheese, and talking about human thought, a little bit of free will. I stole this from a book I recently read, but it said a lot of us believe that we are the kings and queens of the castles of our mind, but actually we're just the gatekeepers. We don't control any of the material that pops into our heads. We just have the choice to give it power or not. We can choose to give it, we can focus attention on it, or we can let it pass. The same way it's almost impossible to try to forget something, but it's easier to replace it, right, with new things that pop into your head. It's hard for us to get a song out of our heads, so we have no idea why it popped into our heads in the first place. So any thoughts on the relationship between consciousness and how ideas pop into our heads? Like, where's that stuff coming from? Is there some river out in space that our consciousness is letting our fleshy bodies tap into, or what's going on there? Why do we have the thoughts we have?
So I think this again comes back to the kind of ideas of chaos and entropy. Much like the external world is full of constantly changing stimuli, we're constantly hearing different things, seeing different things, smelling different things. The internal world, which is mostly narrative driven, all the words,
Mm-hmm.
but much less restricted than the external world because the external world depends on objective reality,
And physics and stuff.
physics, some fundamental principles. The internal world is probably prone to much more chaos. So ideas can very much occur just by random associations, the random activity of one area of the brain stimulating thoughts and ideas, and then the conscious narrative, in some sense, combining loose associated ideas into something else, much like chucking a bunch of words into a bucket, pulling them all out, and telling a story based on those words, similar to the game we played in the pub yesterday. But it doesn't mean that the story is inherently within the words, but rather the story is something that we construct based upon the words.
So for a 4 or 5 year old child, let's say she's not familiar, right, with the concept of humans having favorites, like a favorite food or a favorite destination for holidays, and some adults ask her, "What's your favorite color?" And she doesn't understand. She likes green and yellow and all these other colors, but she's never had to choose a favorite before. And so the adults explain to her that you have to like one color more than all the others. If you could only dress in one color, which would it be? Things like this. And so for the first time, her brain starts grinding and the gears are going, and she has to choose one of these colors. And that must be very interesting because, as you just said, there's chaos internally. She's been noticing colors her whole life without having the responsibility of labeling one of them as better than another.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now all of a sudden she's told, "What's your best color?" And she has to go back through all of her memories, like, "Well, I like that flower and I like the color of this dog and my mother's hair is this color." And she's also affected by the social situation.
Yes.
Maybe everyone else chose green, maybe I should choose green. Or the man who's asking me has a red tie, maybe I'll say red. you know and we have no real idea which one of these forces is more dominant. Does she want to please the person asking her? Does she want to fit in with her friends? Does she have a vivid memory of being 3 years old and she really loves purple because of this one memory? Or is there some subconscious thing going on? Very fascinating. And how do you see the future of technology and research helping to sort out this chaos in an example like this? Like, can we can we get inside this 4-year-old's head and figure out how she's answering the question of what's her favorite color?
I really hope not, because you can imagine how quickly technology like that would be abused by advertisers.
Everyone would know our favorite color.
Yeah. Can you imagine going on Google and it shows you what you actually want before you even knew what it was? Like, this is your favorite color shirt and this is your favorite logo. Oh my god, how did you know? I must buy this.
No, we've already bought it for you.
Yeah. At the amount that you would feel appropriate to pay for it. Oh my god. So I think also the problem is personality comes into play, individual differences, the things that make us fundamentally unique. This girl will have, based on her lifestyle, the things she's experienced, based on how she feels at the time, based on what strategy she's using. All of these things can influence what decision she may make. If she doesn't trust the person who's asking her the question, or she feels quite guarded and defensive, and as you say, she sees a red tie, she might just say, "Oh, red," to kind of end the interview quickly. The very same question provided to her by her mother, who, she shares many experiences with, might have a different emotional response. She'll feel warm and comfortable and think, "Oh, I can explore my favorite color with my mum," and she might think, of warm maternal colors, right?
Yeah.
She may have a favorite food. It depends entirely on what types of association she will engage, which again depends on the types of experiences that she's had. But all of these things are built on experience, the environment, the internal and the external environment.
You mentioned consciousness is hard to define, and you just brought up a word, personality. Would you agree that's also a bit hard to tie down with limits?
Um, Not quite my field, but from my understanding of personality, it's actually a pretty well defined field. It has been whittled down to 5, if not 6, core concepts. And those are openness, agreeableness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, OCEAN. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Oh yeah, you got it. Okay,
that's all 5.
There you go.
And truthfulness or trust is kind of lost over.
We don't need trust.
Like,
we don't need
people
trust.
can be trustful, people can be mistrustful. Like, that's something that we can look at.
We don't need trust for this.
But personality is largely misunderstood in the general population. Or perhaps you could argue that no, science has made personality too minimal. But it mostly just looks at kind of very basic reactions that you'll have to a situation in terms of your impulses almost. So if you look at extroversion and introversion, for example, you could look at that almost as if I chuck a sweet on the table and I have an extrovert and an introvert and I say, do what you want, the extrovert's more likely to immediately grasp out and go for it, whereas the introvert might be kind of umming and ahhing and go, maybe the introvert wants to talk about it before they go for the sweet, whilst the extrovert's already taken it. So I think personality on that sense whittles down to some very basic biological aspects in terms of the types of motivation that a child has. It is an avoidant child, more introverted, or an approaching child, more extroverted.
Almost how we classify animals. Like, this animal hunts at night. This animal is bold and attacks its prey, whereas this animal, slinks back and waits. And we can kind of get the bare bones of human personality.
Yes.
Again, we've talked a bit about how we all want ourselves to be important, right? We kind of disassociate with parts of ourselves that we don't like. When a weird thought pops into our head, we say, well, that wasn't me. And we now have consciousness, we have personality, we have the self-narrative. It's all starting to come together.
Yeah.
Where you can see how, with questions of free will, maybe we're a bit more like a machine than we like to think. We've been programmed over decades to react in a certain way when someone holds a door for us, or when light shines in our eyes, or when somebody makes a fool of themselves in public, we get uncomfortable.
Yeah.
We get embarrassed for them. We don't want to look at them. It makes it worse. And we think it's free will. We're like, well, you can choose whatever you want, but you're probably going to choose this. And we don't like to hear that. Very fascinating. What do you think is the hope for the future of consciousness? Can people be, in the future of AI and augmented reality and nanites in our blood? Is there some kind of great hope for humanity that we'll always at least have our consciousness that'll keep us an organic species, or are we just to throw consciousness down the tubes of personality and we're just gonna label it with a few tags here and there and then move on to the tech revolution?
The current state of science in terms of consciousness, I would actually argue that the way we do science will not reveal much about consciousness, because we currently use quite an old-fashioned classical approach to statistics and analyzing of data. And consciousness is an incredibly dynamic process. It's a system that's changing all the time. You can't make predictions about a system which is constantly changing, at least not meaningful ones. What we try to do is make a very simple prediction about what we'd expect consciousness to do from point A to point B, and we ignore what's happening between point A and point B, and we say, oh look, either it did or didn't do what I predicted. If it did, I can say, that's science, I've caught consciousness. But if it didn't, we say, that wasn't consciousness, I've missed it. And we have all these simple A-B relationships between predictions and effects. But consciousness is in itself the actual process between A and B, not the point between A and B. And I think this can be best understood in terms of the metaphor of motion, or the metaphor of going to the cinema. You know, you go to the cinema, and what you're actually watching is a sequence of still frames.
Correct.
Still frames with audio played separately, which is actually not related to the frames at all, apart from the fact that it was recorded together. But when I go to the cinema, I don't see image, and hear an audio track. I watch a film, and I see a coherent film. Now, can you explain the experience of watching a film purely based on frames and audio? No. The film is being kind of bound together in some space. And again, now we go back to consciousness. It's consciousness that's binding the film. That is possible, but that doesn't really answer any questions.
So the data you talk about, for example, in that metaphor, you would say this one frame of the film, 34% of the pixels are black.
Yes.
Well, that's lovely data, but does that help us understand why certain people like the film or not? No.
I think
like maybe it's a horror movie and there's a lot of dark backgrounds, but the acting is poor, so people didn't like it. Or maybe it's The Matrix and the concept is new and the special effects are amazing.
Yeah.
But you're still going to have the same data of, that frame was 34% black pixels.
Yes.
It doesn't really relate to the movie, the full experience.
So the problem is that within the realms of consciousness science, you choose an element that you're going to explain. Mm-hmm. So you will choose a frame from that film, or you will choose one segment of audio from that film. And through looking at a single frame, you'll be trying to make predictions about the film, which the story of the film does not relate specifically to a frame. In fact, you could remove an entire frame and the film would still carry on. You could probably remove half of the audio and half of the film, and still the overall meaning of the film would make sense. But the way science currently works is to say frame A, frame B, audio C. All of those together must make sense here, so we can make predictions about it. But consciousness itself is not the frames. It is the flowing, coherent film.
So because of these unique circumstances, do you believe that there could be a giant leap forward in the popular acceptance of consciousness and the future of consciousness from a not so scientific hypothesis? Not so much so in biology, right? If someone just says, I think cells work like this, the public's not just going to accept it. They're going to say, show us in the lab. Show us the cells. But because we can't really do that, as we've just explained with the film analogy, if somebody comes along and says, I think we're all connected to consciousness like this, and they give a very compelling emotional story, and the public says to the scientific community, hey, we want to believe this, can we? Do you feel that this is one area of science that'll kind of be cool with it? And I'm just like, yeah, hey, we can't really tell you otherwise. Go ahead.
I mean, if you look at thousands of years of philosophical explorations into consciousness and the fact that we still have, a developing consciousness science, then I would say probably not. Because if we were willing to accept purely theoretical data, we've got thousands of years of it found across religions, found across philosophers, and we're still going, no, we need to do some good science.
Oh, okay.
But I think the thing is, you can't make product out of philosophy. Philosophy doesn't create tangible things. So if you want to actually make progress within consciousness science in terms of producing something that you can actually use, you need scientific data. You need something solid, something that you can hold. And I do think that it is possible, but not in the way that science is being done today. To start with, people need to stop selecting frames. You can't do much work with one frame of the film. But if you have the person who's working on the audio, the person who's working on the frames, the person who's working on the next frame, and you bring a much more collective group of people who are all looking at different aspects and try to come up with some kind of consensus on what the hell it is that they're talking about in the first place, instead of 100 pieces of research going in this direction, 100 going in that direction, all of which loosely tied up in consciousness research, whilst none of them actually braving it enough to say, by the way, this is the definition of what we're trying to study. You can produce a lot of data, and there is huge amounts of data being produced, but this is again part of the replication crisis, the mass production of novelty. You can get funded for creating new projects, not necessarily for going over old works and looking at the impact in today's research, but you'll get funding if you go, oh, this is a new idea that's never been done, and then you loosely throw on, oh, this might be related to AI or uploading of consciousness to the machines, and some funding body goes, oh, that could be good.
Yeah, I saw that film.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen Ex Machina. Reality, the outcomes are probably much smaller. The definition of consciousness needs to be much more concise. I would argue that perhaps the smallest possible definition by which researchers can agree upon might be a good starting point. So, 80% of us say, right, consciousness must at least be this. Then work on just that, and keeping the other things at bay for a while.
That's interesting, as a lot of science is positive. It's trying to see what is happening in, like, what are we observing? What color is this bird? But maybe since consciousness is such a slippery fish, and AI is fast approaching human levels, maybe we're going to have to define consciousness as, what other things aren't. If we believe we're conscious, but a computer 20 years from now that can tell jokes and fall in love and get angry, is not conscious, we can say, well, what's the difference? Who knows, huh?
And I would argue that we don't really have any right to suggest that purely because a computer is synthetic, it cannot be conscious, especially based on the limited understanding that we have of what consciousness is at the moment. And given that I'm kind of drawn to the idea that all systems with the capacity to choose must have some type of experience, why should it be that an informational system, purely based on its synthetic nature, should not have the capacity to choose, especially if the system can actually make preferential decisions? Then it must have in front of it some interface by which it goes, this over this.
You could argue that the computer that we didn't teach chess to, but we just taught it the rules of chess, the limitations and how the pieces moved and how you win the game. And it basically played games with itself, thousands of times until it figured out its own strategies. When that computer plays an opponent, even if the opponent makes the same opening moves, the computer who's taught itself chess sometimes reacts differently. Now, you could say, how come the first game it did this and the second game it did that? The same question is, how come this bacteria moved towards this and how come it moved away from that? And then you look at a human who we agree is a conscious being. How come the girl chose purple and not red for her favorite color? You could argue that these three decision makers, the chess computer, the girl, and the bacteria, are all operating in the same theater. So they're either all conscious or they're either all not.
Yes.
And if we believe that the girl choosing her favorite color is conscious, then the bacteria must be as well, and also the self-teaching computer.
Yes.
So, and that is a fascinating kind of statement, and it really gets me excited about our relationship with these things in the future, like computers or even animals. If we end up decoding their language, so to speak, will we let them vote? if the people of Florida are voting on something that affects the dolphins, and we can understand dolphin language, can the dolphins vote?
But you have to be careful at thinking what kind of consciousness these things must have.
Okay.
So the bacteria has two choices. So it has an incredibly limited capacity for consciousness. I'm not going to ask it questions about politics if I could somehow communicate with it, right? The machine which can play chess, I would argue probably is conscious of chess and nothing else. It's not sitting there waiting to be attached to the internet so it can start doing the works of Shakespeare. Even if you gave it the capacity to be in this environment, I would argue that it probably wouldn't make any sense of it, or if it did, it would process everything within the rules of chess. You'd have it, producing art in the shapes of chess movements, because within its realm of capability, it is only programmed to do chess. And I would argue that a human is similar in that sense. It's just that the number of processing realms or subunits that we have, so say chess is one and avoiding and approaching is another, we are just a capacity of many, many of these sub-processes. And when we bring them together under some umbrella, which is consciousness, and say, all of these sub-processes are mine, we identify with a series of informational sub-processes and say, that's me.
Well, there you go, folks. Stop listening, go out there and identify with informational sub-processes to your heart's content. Which is funny because the heart just pumps blood. It should be to your brain's content. Right? Heart doesn't care.
No.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, happy St. Patrick's Day coming up, I guess. Is that coming up?
I'm sure. And happy
Sure.
Hanukkah.
Hanukkah sometime this year, yeah.
Easter is probably the closest one.
Something like that. Get your bunnies ready. They lay eggs now this time of year. Well, thank you, Master Nicky. It's been good here in Hove, and we'll catch you around the block.
It was a pleasure.
Shaking hands emoji.
Yep.
Oh, it was.